My sister called our mom a pathetic and desperate at her birthday dinner for finding love again. Her silence was glorious when I exposed her secret double life. My sister Alexis was 26 years old and had never heard the word no in her entire life, because our mother believed that raising a confident daughter meant never letting her experience disappointment. When Alexis was 5 and threw a tantrum in Target, Mom bought her 3 toys instead of addressing the behavior, because she didn't want to crush her spirit. When Alexis failed math in 7th grade, Mom hired 4 different tutors until she found one who would just do the homework for her, because struggle might damage her self-esteem. When Alexis crashed her first car drunk at 17, Mom covered it up and bought her a better car because everyone makes mistakes, and she didn't want one bad choice to ruin Alexis's future. By the time Alexis hit her 20s, she was a complete monster who expected everyone to cater to her every whim. She lived at home rent-free while Mom paid for her gym membership, her meal deliveries, her streaming services, her clothes, her gas, everything. Alexis worked part-time at a boutique but spent her entire paycheck on concerts and trips with her friends. When Mom suggested she contribute to household expenses, Alexis would scream that Mom was trying to control her life, and Mom would immediately apologize and give her extra money for the emotional distress. The dynamic was that Mom desperately wanted Alexis's approval, and Alexis knew exactly how to manipulate that desperation. She'd give Mom the silent treatment for days over minor disagreements, then Mom would beg for forgiveness and buy her something expensive. She'd threaten to move out and never speak to Mom again if she didn't get her way, and Mom would panic and give in. She'd tell Mom that all her friends' parents were more supportive, and Mom would try harder to prove she was a good mother. I tried talking to Mom about enabling Alexis, but she'd say I was jealous of their close relationship. I lived 3 hours away and had built my own life without any help, but according to Mom, that meant I didn't need her while poor Alexis was still finding herself. Mom would actually brag to people about how Alexis still needed her, and how nice it was to feel useful as a parent. She couldn't see that Alexis was using her like a personal ATM and emotional punching bag. Things escalated when Mom started dating Robert after being single since Dad died 8 years ago. Robert was a nice guy who treated Mom well, but Alexis immediately hated him because he represented a threat to her control. She'd refuse to be in the same room as him and demand Mom choose between them. She'd schedule fake emergencies whenever Mom had plans with Robert. She'd cry about how Mom was replacing Dad and abandoning her for some random man. Mom tried to balance both relationships, but Alexis made it impossible. The breaking point happened at Mom's birthday dinner last month. Mom had invited me, Robert, and Alexis to a nice restaurant to celebrate. Alexis showed up an hour late and immediately started complaining. The restaurant was too loud. Her chair was uncomfortable. The menu didn't have anything she wanted. She ordered the most expensive item, then sent it back 3 times. She was clearly trying to ruin the evening, and it was working. Mom was getting flustered, and Robert was trying to keep things pleasant, but Alexis kept escalating. When Robert gave Mom a small jewelry box for her birthday, Alexis lost it completely. She stood up and said, "Are you seriously accepting gifts from this man like some desperate whore?" The entire restaurant went silent. Mom's face crumbled and she started to cry. Robert stood up to defend her, but Alexis kept going. "You're pathetic, Mom, throwing yourself at the first man who shows interest. Dad would be disgusted seeing you act like a horny teenager. What kind of mother prioritizes getting laid over her own daughter? You're nothing but a selfish whore who never loved any of us, you just wanted attention." Mom was sobbing and trying to speak, but Alexis wouldn't stop. She went on this vicious rant about how Mom was embarrassing herself chasing after Robert like a dog in heat, and how everyone was laughing at her behind her back. She said Mom was a terrible mother who only cared about male validation, and that's why Dad probably died to get away from her. That's when I snapped. I stood up and said, "Actually, Alexis, let's talk about who the real whore is here. Because I have something interesting to share with everyone. Remember 2 years ago when you had that pregnancy scare and Mom paid for everything? Well, the guy you said was your boyfriend was actually married and you knew it. You were sleeping with your friend's husband for money and gifts." Mom went completely still. I continued, "Oh, and that weekend workshop you went to last year that Mom paid $2,000 for? That was actually a trip to Miami with a 60-year-old man you met online who was paying you to be his companion. Should I keep going? Because I have screenshots of your sugar baby profile where you list your rates." Alexis's face went white. Nobody moved or spoke for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 seconds. Alexis just stood there with her mouth hanging open, and all the color drained from her face while her hands gripped the edge of the table. Mom looked confused at first, like she didn't understand what I'd said, but then her expression changed to something worse as the words sank in. Robert kept his hand on Mom's shoulder and squeezed gently, while his other hand stayed visible on the table, trying to project calm. The couple at the table next to us stopped eating mid-bite and stared. A woman 2 tables over whispered something to her husband. The server who'd been approaching our table froze with a water pitcher in her hand and slowly backed away. Everyone in that restaurant knew something bad was happening, and they couldn't look away even though they were trying to pretend they weren't watching our family fall apart. Alexis recovered first, like she always did when backed into a corner. She started screaming that I was a jealous liar who made up stories because I couldn't stand that she and Mom were close. Her voice came out high and shaky even though she was trying to sound confident and angry. She pointed at me with a trembling finger and said I'd always been jealous of their relationship, and now I was trying to destroy it with fake evidence and lies. She told Mom not to believe anything I said because I was bitter about living so far away and not being needed. But her face stayed pale and her hands shook as she talked. She kept touching her hair and adjusting her shirt, which she always did when she was lying. Mom knew those tells too because I saw recognition flash across her face. I pulled my phone out of my purse and held it up. I said calmly that I could show everyone the screenshots right now if Alexis wanted to keep calling me a liar. I unlocked the screen and started opening my Photos app. Alexis lunged across the table so fast she knocked over a wine glass. She grabbed for my phone with both hands and her nails scratched my wrist. Robert caught her arm before she could reach the phone and held her back while she struggled against him. The server rushed over looking nervous and asked if everything was okay in this tight, polite voice. Robert kept his grip on Alexis's arm and told the server we were fine, but we'd take the check now. Alexis tried to pull free, but Robert held firm without hurting her. She finally stopped struggling and collapsed back into her chair, breathing hard. The server hurried away, practically running to get our check and get us out of there. Mom finally spoke in this tiny, broken whisper that barely counted as a voice. She asked me if what I said was true, and her eyes were already filling with tears. I could see she knew the answer from how Alexis was acting, but she needed to hear me say it out loud. She needed confirmation that her daughter had done these things. Her hands lay flat on the table like she was trying to steady herself. Robert moved his hand from her shoulder to cover one of her hands. Mom looked at Alexis first, giving her a chance to deny it, but Alexis just stared at the tablecloth. Then Mom looked back at me, waiting. I told Mom yes, it was all true, and I'd had proof for months. I said I didn't know how to tell her without Alexis twisting everything and making me look like the bad guy. I explained that I found out by accident when I visited for Christmas and saw a notification pop up on Alexis's laptop. Alexis started crying immediately, with tears running down her face and her shoulders shaking. She covered her face with her hands and made these sobbing sounds. It was the same crying performance she'd used 1,000 times before to get out of trouble or get what she wanted. But this time, Mom didn't jump up to comfort her. Mom didn't reach across the table or make soothing sounds. She just sat there watching Alexis cry with this blank expression on her face. That scared me more than anything else because I'd never seen Mom not react to Alexis's tears. Robert spoke quietly and suggested we should leave since we were making a scene. He raised his hand to signal the server for our check. Mom sat frozen in her chair like someone had turned her to stone. She stared at the birthday gift from Robert still sitting unopened on the table. I felt this twist in my stomach seeing her face so empty and hurt. Part of me wondered if I'd just made everything worse by exposing Alexis in public like this. Maybe I should have found a private way to tell Mom. But then I remembered Alexis calling Mom a desperate whore in front of everyone, and I pushed the guilt away. This needed to happen even if it was ugly. The server brought the check and Robert paid with cash while the rest of us sat in silence. Other diners had stopped pretending not to watch and were openly staring now. I heard whispers from nearby tables. A teenage girl had her phone out like she might be recording. We finally stood up and walked toward the exit with everyone watching. Mom moved like a robot, just putting one foot in front of the other. Robert kept his hand on her back, guiding her. Alexis followed behind us with mascara running down her face. The hostess held the door open with this awkward smile and told us to have a good evening. We walked out into the parking lot where the cool night air hit my face. Alexis immediately tried to hug Mom in the parking lot. She wrapped her arms around Mom and said she was sorry and she'd made some mistakes, but I was making everything sound worse than it was. She said we could talk about this at home and figure everything out. But Mom stepped back from the hug for the first time I could ever remember. She actually moved away from Alexis's embrace and put physical distance between them. Alexis's face showed real panic as her arms dropped to her sides. She looked at Mom like she'd been slapped. This was new territory for both of them because Mom had never rejected Alexis's affection before. Alexis tried to step closer again, but Mom held up her hand to stop her. I told Mom that the guy from 2 years ago with the pregnancy scare was Vaughn Coleman. I watched her face as I said the name. Mom's face went even paler and she grabbed onto Robert's arm to steady herself. She said she remembered Vaughn because she'd met him at a barbecue at Cassie's house. Alexis had introduced him as just a friend. Mom had even given Alexis money to buy Cassie an expensive birthday present that year. She'd paid for the pregnancy test and the doctor visit and the follow-up appointments. The whole time thinking Alexis was dating some nice single guy. Now she was learning that guy was married to Alexis's friend, and Alexis knew it the whole time. Mom put her hand over her mouth like she might be sick. Alexis switched tactics immediately and started screaming at me. She yelled that I had no right to invade her privacy and go through her personal messages. She said I was a terrible sister who wanted to ruin her life out of jealousy. She was trying to make this about my betrayal instead of her actions. She kept pointing at me and saying I was the real problem here for spying on her and sharing private information. It was classic Alexis manipulation, turning herself into the victim. She said I'd violated her trust and destroyed our family by airing her business in public. She demanded to know what kind of person goes through their sister's private messages. Robert spoke up for the first time since we left the restaurant. His voice came out calm but firm as he told Alexis that what she'd said to Mom inside was cruel and wrong no matter what else happened. He said calling her own mother those names in public was unforgivable. Alexis looked shocked that Robert was speaking at all because she'd probably expected him to stay quiet like most people did around her drama. Robert kept his arm around Mom and looked directly at Alexis without backing down. He said Mom deserved better treatment than what Alexis had given her tonight. Mom turned away from Robert and looked at me with eyes that seemed empty of everything except hurt. Her voice came out flat and dead when she asked how long I'd known about Alexis's secret life. I felt my stomach twist because I knew this answer would hurt her too, but I couldn't lie anymore. I told her I found out about 6 months ago when I visited for Christmas. Mom's face didn't change, but her hands started shaking at her sides. I explained that I wanted to find the right way to tell her, but every time I thought about it, Alexis would escalate her behavior, and I couldn't watch her abuse Mom anymore. I said tonight when Alexis called her those horrible names in front of everyone, I just snapped and couldn't hold it in any longer. Mom nodded slowly like she was processing information from very far away. Alexis suddenly spun toward me and demanded to know how I found out about her private business. Her voice was high and shrill with panic replacing the earlier anger. I looked directly at her and explained that I saw a notification pop up on her laptop when I visited for Christmas. She'd left it open on the kitchen counter when she went to take a shower. A message from her sugar baby profile appeared on the screen discussing rates and availability for an upcoming weekend. I told her I took screenshots because I knew she'd deny everything if I didn't have proof. Alexis's face went from white to red, and she started screaming that I had no right to go through her personal messages. Mom held up her hand to stop Alexis, and asked me in that same dead voice what else I knew. I could see she needed to hear everything at once instead of finding out piece by piece over time. I told her about the Miami trip last year that Alexis claimed was a professional development workshop. Mom's eyes widened slightly because she remembered that trip clearly. I explained it was actually a paid vacation with a man named Gideon Olson, who was 60 years old, and had paid Alexis to be his companion for the weekend. Mom made a small sound like someone had punched her in the stomach. She said she remembered being so proud that Alexis was investing in her career development. She'd even helped Alexis pick out outfits for the trip and given her extra money for nice dinners. Now she was learning the whole thing was a lie and she'd funded her daughter's sugar baby activities. Alexis tried one more time to convince Mom that I was making everything sound worse than it was and that I was lying out of jealousy. But Mom cut her off mid-sentence and said she wanted to see my proof right now. The way Mom's voice came out sharp and demanding shocked both me and Alexis into silence. This was the first time I'd ever heard Mom directly challenge Alexis, instead of just accepting whatever version of events Alexis presented. Alexis opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out when she saw Mom's face. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder where I'd saved all the screenshots. I showed Mom the messages about payment amounts with specific dollar figures listed for different services. I showed her the sugar baby profile with Alexis's photos and a description of what she was looking for in an arrangement. I showed her the text messages between Alexis and Vaughn, discussing when his wife Cassie would be out of town so they could meet up. Mom took my phone with shaking hands and started scrolling through everything. Her face got paler with each screenshot she looked at. Alexis stood there looking trapped like an animal with nowhere to run. She kept opening her mouth to say something, then closing it again when she saw what Mom was reading. Mom spent several minutes going through all the evidence without saying a word. When she finally handed my phone back, her hands were still trembling. She looked at Alexis and told her to get in her car because they were going home to talk about this. Alexis immediately started arguing that she wasn't going anywhere, and Mom couldn't tell her what to do. She fell back on her usual defiance that had always worked before. She said she was an adult and Mom had no right to order her around. Robert stepped forward and offered to drive Mom home since she was clearly too upset to drive safely. Mom accepted without even looking at Alexis. This casual dismissal of Alexis's presence seemed to scare Alexis more than anything else that had happened. She was used to Mom focusing entirely on her and begging for her approval. Having Mom turn away and ignore her completely was new territory. Alexis suddenly changed tactics again and started apologizing in this desperate voice. She said she'd explain everything and it wasn't as bad as it looked. She promised they could talk about it and work everything out. But Mom just walked toward Robert's car without responding or acknowledging that Alexis was even speaking. I watched real fear cross Alexis's face as she realized her usual manipulation tactics weren't working anymore. She followed Mom toward the car, still talking and apologizing, but Mom climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door without looking back. Robert walked around to the driver's side and they pulled out of the parking lot, leaving Alexis and me standing there. I turned to Alexis and told her she should probably follow Mom home if she wanted any chance of fixing this situation. Alexis whipped around to face me with pure hatred burning in her eyes. She hissed that I'd destroyed our family and Mom would never forgive me for humiliating her in public like this. She said I was a terrible sister who wanted to ruin her life because I was jealous of her relationship with Mom. I didn't respond because there was nothing left to say. Alexis got in her car and peeled out of the parking lot, probably heading to Mom's house. I walked to my own car and sat in the driver's seat for a minute before starting the engine. My hands were shaking now that the confrontation was over. I drove home alone, replaying the whole scene in my head over and over. The adrenaline that had carried me through the restaurant confrontation started wearing off and left me feeling shaky and uncertain about what I'd done. Part of me felt completely justified for protecting Mom from Alexis's abuse and manipulation. Another part of me wondered if I'd just made everything worse by exposing Alexis so publicly in front of a restaurant full of strangers. I kept seeing Mom's face when she looked at those screenshots, and the way her hands shook as she scrolled through the evidence of what her daughter had really been doing. I wondered if Mom would end up blaming me for destroying her relationship with Alexis, instead of blaming Alexis for her own choices. My phone buzzed about an hour after I got home and I grabbed it hoping for some update from Mom. It was Robert texting that he got Mom home safely, and she asked him to give her some space to talk with Alexis alone. He added that he wanted to thank me for standing up for Mom even though he knew it was hard to do what I did. Reading his message made me feel slightly better about my methods, but not enough to stop the sick feeling in my stomach. I kept replaying the moment when I exposed Alexis, and seeing Mom's face crumble as she scrolled through those screenshots. Part of me wondered if I should have found a private way to tell Mom instead of humiliating Alexis in front of a restaurant full of strangers. But another part of me remembered all the times Alexis had publicly humiliated Mom and figured she deserved a taste of her own medicine. I tried to watch TV to distract myself but couldn't focus on anything. Every few minutes, I checked my phone hoping Mom would text or call with an update. I imagined what was happening at the house right now with Mom and Alexis talking. Actually, talking was probably the wrong word since Alexis would be doing her usual routine of crying and making excuses while Mom tried to comfort her. By midnight, I still hadn't heard anything from Mom, so I finally sent her a text asking if she was okay. The message showed as delivered, but she didn't respond. I lay in bed staring at my phone screen, willing it to light up with a reply. My mind kept spinning through worst-case scenarios like Mom completely forgiving Alexis and deciding I was the problem for exposing family secrets, or Alexis convincing Mom that I made everything up out of jealousy, and now Mom would never speak to me again. I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning and woke up to my phone ringing at 9. Mom's name flashed on the screen and my heart started pounding as I answered. Her voice sounded completely exhausted and flat when she asked if I could come over because she needed to talk to both of us together. The tone was different from her usual anxious, people-pleasing voice. She sounded older somehow and very tired. I told her I could be there in a few hours, and she just said okay, and hung up without any of her normal chattiness. I got dressed quickly and started the 3-hour drive to Mom's house feeling nervous about what I was walking into. The whole drive I kept trying to figure out what Mom wanted to say that required both of us there together. Maybe she was going to announce that she was cutting both of us off because she couldn't deal with the drama anymore. Or maybe she was going to make us apologize to each other and play happy family. When I pulled up to Mom's house, I immediately noticed Alexis's car still in the driveway, which surprised me. I figured Alexis would have stormed off to stay with friends like she usually did when things got difficult. Mom opened the door before I could knock, and I barely recognized her face. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, but her expression looked strangely calm and determined instead of the usual anxious uncertainty. She told me to come in and that Alexis was already in the living room. I followed Mom inside and found Alexis sitting on the couch looking like she hadn't slept either. Her makeup was smeared and her hair was messy, and she wouldn't look at me when I sat down in the chair across from her. Mom stood in front of both of us and announced that she spent all night thinking about everything that happened. She said she realized she had failed both of us as a parent in different ways. She told Alexis directly that she created a monster by never making her face any consequences for her actions. Then she turned to me and said she forced me to become the parent by refusing to see the truth about what was happening. Alexis started to interrupt with some excuse, but Mom actually raised her voice and told her to be quiet for once and just listen. I had never heard Mom use that sharp tone with Alexis in my entire life. Both Alexis and I just stared at Mom in complete shock, because this wasn't the doormat mother we knew. Mom continued talking in that same firm voice and told Alexis she had exactly 1 month to find a job that paid enough to cover rent somewhere else. She said Alexis would not be living in this house for free anymore, and that was final. Alexis's face went from shocked to furious in seconds, and she started yelling that Mom couldn't just kick her out with nowhere to go. She said it wasn't fair, and Mom was being cruel, and she had no way to afford an apartment on such short notice. Mom didn't back down or apologize like she normally would have. Instead, she told Alexis that she had 26 years of support and free rides, and all of that ended right now. She said if Alexis wanted to continue having any relationship with her, then she needed to start acting like an adult instead of a spoiled child. Alexis turned to me with desperation on her face and begged me to talk some sense into Mom. She said I was the reasonable one and I needed to explain to Mom that this was too extreme. But I stayed completely quiet because this was exactly what needed to happen about 10 years ago. Alexis realized I wasn't going to help her and her face twisted with rage. She jumped up from the couch and started screaming that she was leaving right now and we would never see her again. It was her usual threat that had always worked perfectly to make Mom panic and give in. But this time, Mom just looked at her calmly and said, "Okay." She didn't chase after Alexis or beg her to stay or promise to change her mind. Alexis stood there for a moment, clearly expecting Mom to crack and start apologizing. When Mom just kept looking at her with that same calm expression, Alexis grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door. She yelled over her shoulder that we would both regret this and slammed the front door so hard the pictures on the wall shook. We heard her car start up, and then the sound of tires squealing as she peeled out of the driveway way too fast. The house went completely silent after Alexis left. Mom stood frozen in the same spot for about 10 seconds, and then her face crumpled and she started sobbing. I got up and put my arms around her while she cried harder than I'd ever seen her cry before. She kept saying between sobs that she didn't know who Alexis really was anymore. She asked how she could have raised someone who was capable of doing those terrible things to other people. I tried to tell Mom that Alexis made her own choices and Mom couldn't take responsibility for everything, but Mom shook her head hard and pulled away from my hug. She said no. This was on her because she enabled every single bad choice by protecting Alexis from consequences. Her voice got stronger as she talked, and she started listing all the times she made excuses for Alexis's behavior. The drunk driving incident where she paid off the other driver instead of letting Alexis face charges. The time Alexis stole money from her purse and Mom just gave her more instead of confronting her. The countless jobs Alexis quit or got fired from where Mom always blamed the boss or the coworkers instead of Alexis. She said every time Alexis did something wrong, Mom threw money at the problem or made excuses, and that taught Alexis she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. Mom's hands were shaking as she counted off all these moments, and I realized she'd been aware of the pattern for a long time, but couldn't admit it to herself. She said she kept telling herself she was being a supportive mother, but really she was just scared of Alexis rejecting her. Mom looked at me with red eyes and asked why I didn't tell her sooner about what I discovered. Her voice was quiet and hurt, and I felt my stomach twist with guilt. I admitted I was afraid she would choose Alexis over me like she always does. The words came out before I could stop them, and Mom's face crumbled again. She started crying harder and grabbed my hand, saying she was so sorry for making me feel that way. She said she understood now why I didn't trust her to handle the truth about Alexis. She kept apologizing over and over for putting Alexis first and making me feel like I didn't matter as much. I started crying too because hearing Mom finally acknowledge it made years of feeling invisible suddenly real. We sat there on the couch crying together for a while before Mom wiped her eyes and said we needed to talk honestly. We spent the whole afternoon talking for the first time in years without the usual careful dancing around topics. Mom told me about all the times she knew Alexis was manipulating her, but convinced herself she was just being a supportive mother. She described moments where Alexis would give her the silent treatment, and Mom would panic thinking she was a bad parent. She talked about how scared she was of Alexis cutting her off completely, so she just kept giving in to every demand. Mom said she realized now that she wasn't helping Alexis. She was hurting her by never making her face reality. She told me about times when Alexis was younger where Mom saw warning signs, but ignored them because addressing them felt too hard. Like when Alexis bullied kids at the school, and Mom blamed the other children for being too sensitive. Or when Alexis lied constantly, and Mom pretended to believe her because confronting the lying meant admitting her daughter had a problem. Mom's voice got quieter as she admitted she was so focused on being Alexis's friend that she forgot to be her parent. She said after Dad died she felt so alone, and Alexis needing her made her feel useful and wanted. That need became more important than actually helping Alexis grow into a decent person. Around 5 that evening, Robert called to check on Mom. She put him on speaker and told him what happened with Alexis storming out. Robert's voice was gentle as he offered to come over, but Mom said she needed time to process everything. She thanked him for being patient with her complicated family situation, and Robert said he wasn't going anywhere. After she hung up, Mom looked at me and said, Robert deserved better than the mess she'd created with Alexis. I told her Robert clearly cared about her and seemed willing to deal with the complications. Mom smiled a little for the first time that day. Over the next few days, Alexis sent Mom dozens and dozens of texts. I saw Mom's phone lighting up constantly with messages that went from apologizing to blaming me for turning Mom against her. Some texts said Alexis was sorry and wanted to come home and talk. Others said I was a jealous person who always wanted to ruin Alexis's relationship with Mom. A few said Mom was being cruel and unreasonable for kicking her out with nowhere to go. Mom read each one with this tired expression, but only responded once. Her message was short, saying the 1-month deadline stands, and Alexis needs to figure out her living situation. No arguing or explaining, just a simple statement. I watched Mom type it and hit send without the usual anxiety about Alexis's reaction. I got my own flood of nasty texts from Alexis over those same days. She called me every name she could think of in messages that got meaner as days went by. She said I was a jealous person who destroyed her life because I couldn't stand that Mom loved her more. She accused me of making up lies about her just to hurt her. She said I was a terrible sister who never supported her and always tried to make her look bad. The messages got worse until she started threatening to tell everyone lies about me to ruin my reputation. She said she'd make sure no one in our family ever spoke to me again. That's when I blocked her number because I wasn't going to engage with her manipulation tactics anymore. A week after the birthday dinner disaster, Mom told me she'd made an appointment with a therapist. She said she needed help working through her guilt about enabling Alexis and figuring out how to set healthy boundaries going forward. I was proud of her for taking that step instead of just trying to fix everything herself like usual. After her first few sessions, Mom told me the therapist said she was emotionally dependent on Alexis's approval, which is why she couldn't say no. The therapist explained that Mom had made Alexis's happiness her responsibility, and that created an unhealthy dynamic where Alexis had all the power. Mom was learning that loving someone doesn't mean giving them everything they want. 2 weeks after the birthday dinner, a woman named Cassie contacted Mom through social media. Mom showed me the message asking if the rumors about Alexis were true. Apparently, word was spreading in their friend group about Alexis's affair with Vaughn. Mom stared at her phone for a long time before responding, and I could see her hands shaking. She typed out a message confirming that yes, Alexis had an affair with Cassie's husband. Mom hit send and then put her phone face down on the table like she couldn't look at it anymore. Within minutes, Cassie called and Mom answered on speaker. Cassie's voice was shaking as she thanked Mom for being honest with her. She said she'd suspected something happened between Vaughn and Alexis, but they both denied it every time she asked. She'd felt crazy for months thinking she was imagining things, but now she finally had confirmation. So Cassie started crying on the phone, saying this gave her what she needed to move forward with her divorce. Mom apologized over and over for what Alexis did, but Cassie said it wasn't Mom's fault. Before hanging up, Cassie mentioned something else that made Mom go pale. She said Alexis had borrowed money from her multiple times over the past year, claiming she needed help with bills. Now Cassie realized Alexis was spending that money on trips and concerts while sleeping with her husband. Mom immediately offered to pay Cassie back every penny, but Cassie said no. She said she just wanted nothing to do with Alexis ever again and hung up. Mom sat there staring at nothing, and I knew she was adding this to the growing list of Alexis's betrayals she was trying to process. 2 days later, the boutique manager called Mom's phone asking if she had new contact information for Alexis, because she hadn't shown up for her scheduled shifts all week. Mom answered the call on speaker while I was visiting, and I watched her face go through several emotions as the manager explained they'd tried Alexis's number multiple times with no response. The manager said they really needed to know if Alexis was coming back or if they should consider her position abandoned because they couldn't keep holding the spot open. Mom told the manager she didn't have current contact information for Alexis and suggested they make whatever staffing decisions they needed to make. After she hung up, Mom sat there staring at her phone, and I could see her mind working through the implications. Alexis had probably been fired for no-call, no-show, which meant she had no income, and Mom started wondering out loud where Alexis was staying and how she was supporting herself. I stopped her before she could spiral into worry mode and reminded her that this was exactly how the cycle started again. Mom admitted she kept wanting to call Alexis and make sure she was okay, but her therapist had told her during their last session that the enabling instinct was the exact thing she needed to resist. She said her therapist explained that worrying about Alexis's well-being was natural, but acting on that worry by rescuing her would undo all the boundary work they'd been doing. Mom picked up her phone 3 different times that afternoon like she was going to text Alexis, then put it back down each time. I stayed with her for a few hours to help her resist the urge to reach out, and we talked about how Alexis was an adult who made her own choices and needed to face the results of those choices. Mom kept saying she knew I was right, but it felt wrong to not know if her daughter was safe or had a place to sleep. I reminded her that Alexis had friends and resources, and if she was truly in danger, she knew how to ask for help. 3 weeks after the restaurant confrontation, I was at work when Mom called me sounding shaky and said Alexis had just shown up at her house. Mom was standing at her front door with Alexis on the porch, begging to be let back in and promising she would change everything. I could hear Alexis's voice in the background pleading and crying while Mom held the phone. Mom told Alexis the answer was no and she needed to figure out her own life, and I heard Alexis start crying harder. Mom's voice was firm when she said Alexis couldn't come back home and needed to find her own place to live. Alexis kept begging and saying she had nowhere else to go, but Mom stood there at the door not moving. I stayed on the phone listening while Mom repeated that Alexis was 26 years old and needed to be responsible for herself now. After a few more minutes of Alexis crying and pleading, Mom told me she needed to go, but she was going to hold firm on her boundary. She hung up and I sat at my desk worried about what would happen next, but also proud that Mom was actually following through. Mom called me back an hour later and said she'd let Alexis sit on the porch and cry for about 20 minutes before Alexis finally broke down for real. These weren't the manipulative tears Alexis usually used, but actual genuine crying, where she admitted she'd been staying with different friends, but was running out of places to go. Alexis told Mom through the door that she'd applied for jobs but hadn't heard back yet, and she was scared about what was going to happen to her. Mom said hearing Alexis actually admit she was scared, instead of demanding or manipulating, made her want to cave in and let her inside. But instead, Mom opened the door and told Alexis she was sorry she was struggling. But this was what growing up felt like. Mom said she should have made Alexis face reality years ago instead of protecting her from every hard thing. Then Mom offered to help Alexis make a budget and look for apartments she could afford, but she wouldn't let her move back home. Alexis looked shocked that Mom was offering help without giving in completely, and she asked if Mom was serious about helping with apartment hunting. Mom said yes, she would meet Alexis at coffee shops to look at listings and fill out applications, but the boundary about not living at home wasn't changing. Alexis accepted the offer, and they made plans to meet the next day at a coffee shop near Mom's house. Over the next week, Mom and Alexis met 4 different times at various coffee shops to search rental listings on their laptops and fill out applications for studio apartments. Mom told me their interactions were stiff and awkward without the usual pattern of Alexis demanding things and Mom giving in to keep the peace. They talked about rent prices and security deposits and how much Alexis would need to earn monthly, but avoided discussing anything about the restaurant confrontation or Alexis's secret life. Mom said it felt like they were 2 strangers doing a business transaction instead of mother and daughter, but she was following her therapist's advice about keeping boundaries clear. Alexis showed up to every meeting on time, which was unusual for her, and actually seemed to be taking the apartment search seriously. Around this same time, Robert started coming around again now that the immediate crisis with Alexis had passed. Mom seemed genuinely happy to see him, and they went out for dinner twice that week without any drama or fake emergencies. Alexis actually met Robert once during this period when she showed up for an apartment hunting meeting and he was at Mom's house. Mom told me later that Alexis apologized to Robert for her behavior at the birthday dinner, which shocked everyone. Alexis's apology wasn't elaborate or dramatic, but she looked Robert in the eye and said she was sorry for the things she said, and she was wrong. Robert accepted the apology graciously and said he hoped they could start fresh. I met Mom and Robert for lunch the following weekend, and I could see how much lighter Mom seemed without the constant stress of managing Alexis's chaos. She laughed at Robert's jokes about his work week and talked about maybe taking a vacation together to visit some national parks. These were things Mom never did before because Alexis always needed something or created some crisis that required Mom's attention and money. Mom looked younger somehow, and I realized she'd been carrying the weight of Alexis's dysfunction for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to just enjoy her own life. Robert held Mom's hand across the table and they made plans for a weekend trip next month. After 2 weeks of apartment hunting, Alexis found a studio apartment in an older building that she could afford if she got a full-time job. The rent was $650 a month, which was cheap for the area, but the apartment was small and needed some work. Mom agreed to co-sign the lease, but made Alexis sign a separate agreement stating she would pay rent every single month or face eviction. This was the first time Mom had ever required Alexis to be accountable with actual written consequences instead of just verbal promises. Alexis read through the agreement Mom had typed up and printed, and I could see her face processing that Mom was serious about enforcement this time. Alexis signed it without arguing, and they went to the leasing office together to fill out the application. The boutique manager surprisingly agreed to take Alexis back after she showed up in person to apologize and commit to reliable scheduling. Alexis also picked up extra shifts at a coffee shop down the street from her new apartment to make sure she could cover rent and basic expenses. She called Mom constantly during her first week working both jobs to complain about being tired and broke and how unfair it was that she had to work so much. But she was actually showing up to every shift and doing the work instead of calling in sick or just not appearing. Mom called me 3 days later sounding worried and said she needed to talk about Alexis. We met for lunch at a diner near her house, and Mom picked at her salad while telling me how guilty she felt watching Alexis struggle with things like budgeting groceries and getting to work on time. She said Alexis called her crying last week because she couldn't figure out how to pay all her bills and still have money for food. Mom's voice cracked when she said Alexis should have learned these basic things years ago and it was her fault for never teaching her. I reminded Mom that Alexis was 26 years old, and plenty of people learn adult skills later than others. The important thing was that Alexis was actually learning now instead of just expecting Mom to fix everything. Mom nodded but said it was harder watching Alexis struggle than it would have been to just give her money and make the problems go away. I told her that was exactly the enabling instinct her therapist warned her about, and she needed to let Alexis figure things out even when it was uncomfortable to watch. Mom squeezed my hand across the table and said she knew I was right, but breaking old patterns was harder than she expected. 2 months after the birthday dinner, our family looked completely different from before. Mom and I talked on the phone twice a week and met for lunch every other weekend. Alexis was more distant and only contacted Mom when she needed advice about apartment stuff or work problems. Mom saw Robert openly now without any drama or fake emergencies from Alexis. They went to dinner and movies without Mom constantly checking her phone for crisis texts. Robert came over to Mom's house for coffee on Sunday mornings, and they'd sit on the porch talking about their week. Mom told me they were planning a weekend trip together to visit some state parks up north. She seemed lighter somehow and laughed more easily than she had in years. The constant tension of managing Alexis's chaos was gone, and Mom was remembering what it felt like to just enjoy her own life. She admitted to me that she didn't realize how much energy she'd been spending on worrying about Alexis until she stopped doing it. Alexis invited Mom to see her apartment once she got settled in after living there for 3 weeks. Mom drove over on a Saturday afternoon expecting to find a mess based on how Alexis had always kept her room at home. But when Mom walked in, she was shocked to find the studio clean and organized. Alexis had bought furniture from thrift stores and arranged everything neatly. A small couch sat against one wall with a coffee table she'd found at a garage sale. Her bed was made with sheets she'd purchased herself. The kitchen area was tiny, but Alexis had organized her dishes and kept the counter clear. Mom told me later that Alexis seemed almost proud showing her around and pointing out things she'd bought or fixed herself. Alexis explained how she'd learned to meal prep on Sundays to save money during the week. She showed Mom her budget spreadsheet where she tracked every dollar she spent. Mom said Alexis's face looked different somehow when she talked about managing on her own. There was something new there that hadn't existed before, when everything was just handed to her. Mom and Alexis met for coffee the following week at a place near Alexis's apartment. They sat outside even though it was chilly because Alexis said she couldn't afford to order much and didn't want to take up a table inside. Alexis told Mom the last 2 months had been the hardest of her entire life. She said she'd never been so tired or stressed about money before. But she also said it was the first time she'd felt like she actually accomplished something real. Alexis admitted she understood now why Mom cut her off even though she hated it at the time. She said when everything came easy, she never felt good about anything because she didn't earn it. Now when she paid her rent on time or managed to save $20, she felt proud of herself. Mom told me she almost cried hearing Alexis talk like that. because it was the first time Alexis seemed to understand the connection between effort and reward. Alexis didn't apologize for her past behavior, but she acknowledged that Mom was trying to help her grow up, even if the method felt harsh. I met Alexis for the first time since the restaurant confrontation at a coffee shop halfway between our places. She looked different, with her hair pulled back and wearing clothes that seemed more practical than fashionable. Alexis started by apologizing for the nasty texts and threats she'd sent me in the weeks after the birthday dinner. She said she was angry and hurt and lashed out at me because I was the one who exposed her secrets. I accepted her apology but waited to see if she'd apologize for the actual behavior that led to the exposure. She didn't bring up the affair or the sugar baby stuff at all. Instead, she said she knew I was trying to protect Mom even if my method was harsh and public. Alexis said she understood why I did it after watching her scream at Mom in the restaurant. We sat in awkward silence for a minute before she asked how I was doing, and I gave her basic updates about my work and life. The conversation felt stiff and formal, like we were strangers getting to know each other instead of sisters who'd grown up together. Alexis told me she'd been thinking a lot about why she acted the way she did for so many years. She said she knew her lifestyle was not sustainable, but she didn't know how to stop the cycle. Every time Mom gave her money or fixed a problem, it felt good in the moment, but made her feel worthless inside. She kept demanding more because she thought if she just got enough support, she'd finally feel satisfied. But it never worked that way. Alexis said having everything handed to her made her feel like she couldn't do anything on her own. She developed this pattern where she'd create problems so Mom would solve them and prove she cared. Alexis admitted it was messed up, but she didn't know how else to get Mom's attention and approval. I listened without interrupting, because this was the most honest Alexis had ever been with me. She wasn't making excuses exactly, but she was trying to explain the thinking behind her behavior. I could tell she'd been working through this stuff in her own head, or maybe with a therapist. I told Alexis I was glad she was figuring things out and making changes in her life, but I also said our relationship would take time to rebuild, because I'd spent years watching her abuse Mom and treat everyone around her like garbage. I said I couldn't just forget all of that because she was working 2 jobs now. Alexis looked down at her coffee cup and nodded without arguing. She said she understood, and didn't expect me to forgive her right away. This was major progress from her usual pattern of demanding immediate forgiveness and getting angry when people didn't give it. We finished our coffee and agreed to meet again in a few weeks. I left feeling cautiously hopeful that maybe Alexis was actually changing, and not just putting on an act to get back into Mom's good graces. Time would tell if the changes stuck, or if she'd fall back into old patterns once things got easier. Mom established a new boundary with Alexis where they'd have dinner together once a week, but Mom wouldn't give her money or solve her problems anymore. Their therapist recommended structured contact to rebuild trust slowly, instead of jumping back into their old codependent relationship. Mom told Alexis she'd be available for advice and emotional support but not financial help. If Alexis needed money, she'd have to figure it out herself through extra work shifts or budgeting better. Mom also said she wouldn't drop everything anymore when Alexis had a crisis. She'd listen and offer suggestions, but Alexis needed to handle her own emergencies. Alexis agreed to these terms without the dramatic threats or manipulation she would have used before. They started having dinner every Tuesday at a restaurant near Alexis's apartment. Mom said the dinners were sometimes awkward, but they were learning how to relate to each other in a healthier way. Alexis would talk about her week, and Mom would share updates about Robert and her own life. It felt more like 2 adults having a conversation, instead of a parent managing a child's constant drama. Robert proposed to Mom on their weekend trip to the state parks. He took her to a lookout point with a view of the valley and asked her to marry him. Mom said yes, but told him she needed to talk to both me and Alexis first before making any announcements. She called me that evening sounding happy but nervous. I told her I thought Robert was great and I was happy she found someone who treated her well. Mom asked if I really meant it or if I was just being supportive. I said I genuinely liked Robert and thought he was good for her. Then Mom called Alexis and told her about the proposal. Alexis's reaction surprised everyone by being positive and supportive. She told Mom she deserved happiness, and Robert seemed like a good man who cared about her. Alexis said she was sorry for making things so difficult when they first started dating. Mom cried on the phone with relief because she'd been so worried about how Alexis would react. The fact that Alexis could be happy for Mom instead of making it about herself showed how much she'd grown in just 2 months. Mom planned a family dinner to celebrate the engagement and invited me, Alexis, and Robert to the same restaurant where the birthday dinner disaster happened 2 months earlier. I felt nervous walking in, remembering how that night ended with me exposing Alexis's secrets in front of everyone. But this dinner was completely different from the start. Alexis arrived on time and greeted everyone politely. She shook Robert's hand and told him congratulations. Mom looked relaxed and happy instead of anxious about managing everyone's emotions. Robert held Mom's hand on the table and they looked at each other with genuine affection. Alexis ordered a reasonable meal and didn't complain about anything. She asked Robert questions about his work and seemed genuinely interested in his answers. When the server brought out a small cake to celebrate the engagement, Alexis smiled and raised her water glass for a toast. She said she was happy for both of them and hoped they'd be very happy together. The whole evening felt normal and pleasant, like a real family dinner instead of a battlefield. I watched Mom's face glowing with happiness and felt cautiously hopeful about our family's future. We still had a long way to go to fully heal from years of dysfunction, but this felt like a real start. A few days after the engagement dinner, Mom asked me to come over for coffee because she wanted to talk about something. I drove to her house wondering what was on her mind. And when I arrived, she looked tired, but also more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. We sat at her kitchen table with our coffee, and she started talking about how hard it was watching Alexis struggle with bills and work schedules. She admitted she still had the urge to jump in and fix everything when Alexis called stressed about money or complained about being exhausted from working 2 jobs. Mom said her therapist told her that sitting with the discomfort of not rescuing Alexis was actually the most loving thing she could do right now. She explained that every time she felt the panic rising when Alexis had a problem, she had to remind herself that solving it would only hurt Alexis in the long run. Mom's hands shook a little as she talked about how unnatural it felt to let her daughter struggle, but she was learning that struggle builds strength, and she'd stolen that from Alexis for 26 years. Her therapist called it real progress that Mom could recognize the urge to enable without actually giving into it, and Mom seemed proud of herself, even though I could see how much it cost her emotionally. The next week, Alexis asked if I wanted to grab lunch, which surprised me since we'd barely talked one-on-one since the restaurant disaster. We met at a casual place near her apartment, and she looked different somehow. Less polished and put together, but also more genuine. Alexis told me she'd started seeing a therapist to work through why she developed such bad patterns with Mom and other people. She said the therapist was helping her understand that manipulating people to get what she wanted actually made her feel worse about herself even when it worked. Alexis admitted she knew her behavior hurt Mom and damaged their relationship, but she didn't know how to stop the cycle until Mom finally cut her off. She talked about how therapy was helping her see that she hurt herself too, by never learning to do anything on her own or build real confidence. Sitting there listening to Alexis talk honestly about her issues, I realized that what I did at the restaurant was absolutely brutal and caused real pain for everyone, but it also broke a toxic pattern that was slowly destroying our whole family and might have continued for years if something hadn't forced a change. Mom was genuinely happier now, laughing more and making plans for her future with Robert, instead of just managing Alexis's constant drama. Even Alexis seemed more real and grounded, building an actual life instead of just taking from everyone around her. Our family would never be perfect or go back to how things were before that birthday dinner, but maybe that was actually a good thing. How things were before was deeply sick and getting worse, with Mom losing herself completely, and Alexis becoming more entitled and cruel. Now Mom was setting real boundaries and sticking to them. Alexis was learning what accountability actually meant, and I was watching both of them grow into better versions of themselves. Robert was becoming part of our family in a natural way, and Mom didn't have to choose between him and Alexis anymore, because Alexis had finally learned she couldn't control everything.